So the learning objectives for today is we're going to develop some strategies to respond to feedback in a systematic and reflective manner. We're going to discuss bias and limitations of evaluations. It'll be kind of at the end. And then the other thing we're going to do, which again is something I wish I had known for most of my career as a faculty member, was strategies to prepare students to give constructive and meaningful feedback. I think this is a really important thing to do. And we're not always thinking consciously about the fact that we should do that. And I'm seeing everybody here. Thank you so much, Andrew, for giving advice on renaming. And I'm seeing people getting their names sorted out. So that's wonderful. Lovely to see you all. Welcome, everybody. And all right. Don't forget, if you have any other questions, go ahead and post them in the Zoom chat. All right. So we're going to do a poll really quickly. And see if I can where that is. Just about, hang on, why do I not see my poll? All right, I think I only see Lydia's polls, previous polls. Let's just do it in the Zoom chat. So we're going to do a poll on student evaluations. So if you feel comfortable doing so, in the chat, go ahead and post what you do when you receive student evaluations. Do you read them and make adjustments to your teaching? Do you read them but don't use the feedback? Do you read them and focus on a few negative comments? You never look at them. I have certainly been in a position where I didn't look at them because they were demoralizing. I have a colleague, or I have a colleague read them for me. A, B, and C. Yeah, yeah. Consider adjustment. C. Yeah, yeah. The negative comments. Yep, yep. That seems to be coming up a bunch. Great. Read them and make adjustments to teaching. Wonderful. And also focus on the negative comments. Try to look for themes. Yep. Great. Doing lots of good stuff here. Glad to see no one's completely avoiding them, although that is a totally normal response, actually, I think sometimes, especially if you're feeling very stressed. And maybe you've had a bad semester, that would be a totally fine response. It's maybe not the most helpful in the long term. I think there's good reasons for why you would not look at them if you were feeling, again, very stressed. And one of the things we also do recommend is that you have a colleague read them for you. So if you ever use that strategy because you were sort of worried about what the evaluations were going to say, that would also be fine. So thank you so much for those of you who posted in the chat, and I appreciate you sharing what you do with them. I think, by the way, focusing on a few negative comments is extremely common as well, and it's certainly something that I have done to my detriment in the past. So again, appreciate your responses, and sorry that the poll wasn't quite working well the way it should. One of the things to remember when we're thinking about learner evaluations and learner feedback is that it's only one small piece of the puzzle. There are actually lots of sources of data for how we know our teaching is successful and effective. Self-assessment plays a really huge role in this. So setting aside time to reflect on teaching, what your teaching practices are, and other material from the class. You can also look to your colleagues, not only for doing kind of peer evaluations and giving you feedback, but also what their experiences are, and similarities and differences in whether you've had the same student in the class and the things that you've done, that kind of thing. It can be really important to have those conversations. Looking at the literature, the pedagogical literature, can really help you to determine whether your teaching strategies have been designed well and are effective. And then, of course, again, adding in the student perspective, but don't just remember that it's not just about the evaluations, it's also about the results of the assessment that you've done in the class, how successful they are in terms of, their sort of exams and their assignments, and any other feedback that you're getting along the way. We should remember that student evaluations come at a particularly interesting time. They usually come at the end of the semester or the end of the course when students are stressed, they've got a lot going on, and they are sort of maybe rushing to get through the student evaluations, and also they're not really trained to write evaluations very well. So there may be a lot of things and reasons why student evaluations or student feedback is not as hopeful as it could be, or why we shouldn't just focus on the evaluations, why we should look at them in the context of the rest of the class. So we think it's really important to reframe sets or student evaluations of teaching as formative instead of just summative, which is often how they're used, especially if we're thinking about like promotion and tenure materials. Formative sets are actually, we're seeing this as a formative opportunity. It's really important, and that's why it's really great that many people responded that they're making adjustments where needed. By doing this, you really sort of recognize or are able to recognize what is working well and identify where students are struggling, and then you can address those problems. And it's a sort of ongoing process. And this is really that growth mindset component of it. Whereas summative tends to be about accountability, providing you with a summary of your performance and achievement. Usually comes at the very end and isn't necessarily about growth. It's really just about, okay, did I do my job? Was it successful? And they can be both, but it shouldn't just be summative. So how do you respond to the student evaluations of feedback in a systematic and reflective manner? And many of you may already be doing this, which is great. And so if there's anything here that resonates with you, feel free to post it in the chat. Step one, start with reflection before you even get those student evaluations. So before your student evaluations, your learner feedback comes in the spring, at the end of the spring semester, think about your class, what's going well, what do you think could be improved, what have you noticed, what have you seen, what are some things that students are struggling with? What do you think your students will say in their evaluations? I think having this kind of reflection in advance before those evaluations come in guarantees, or at least partly ensures, that maybe you're not going to be blindsided, that you're going to kind of know what are some of the areas that you're struggling with, or that students are struggling with, and you're already thinking about improvements you can make. And in fact, when you go to talk to your students about their end of semester evaluations, you can talk about the fact that you've also been reflecting and thinking about some pieces of the course that maybe haven't been as well designed as they could be. I've done that in the past where I've asked students to comment specifically on what they thought about a particular aspect of the course, just so I can get some really good feedback to base my changes on. So if there's something that's not quite right, it's good to kind of talk to the students about that in advance. But also then remember that you need evidence for this. So don't just focus on things that you feel are not going well. It's important to think about, okay, what evidence do I actually have to determine whether this is going well or not? Then once you've done that reflective work and the evaluations come in, it's time to read them. And when you read them, focus on the big picture. It's really easy, right, to get hung up on those one or two comments. And so resist the urge. What you really want to be thinking about is that sort of larger picture that, maybe most students are doing well in the class and there's a few outliers who are maybe not. The outlier comments still matter. It's still important to consider them because, the students are giving you that feedback. But focusing on them as a sort of determination of how the entire class went is not particularly helpful. So then you're going to identify trends and outliers, both in the quantitative, it says quantitative here, but also in the qualitative data. So you want to start looking for what the data tells you. Look at the spread of scores and look for the outliers in the spread of the sort of quantitative scores, but also the qualitative. You might then ask a few questions. What are you noticing? Why are people, why do the scores look the way they do? What might I be doing that leads students to feel that way? What could I be doing differently? But again, don't get too hung up on the sort of negative parts and the need to change. You also want to consider the positive comments as well, the things that you have done well. It's really important just to focus on those negative trends. So here we have, sort of a basic chart of some quantitative data. And if I could get someone either just to speak or to post in chat about what they see when they see these results. So if you got results like this, what would you think?
Kind of a scattergram.
Yeah?
Mostly
How would you
positive.
respond?
Yeah, mostly positive.
Mostly positive, right? Sort of in the majority, it's positive. Yeah. So yeah, you'd be very happy med students are usually on the critical side. Yes. Yeah. Right. So fairly well received. Thank you. Yes, fairly well received, but maybe some areas to improve. But overwhelmingly kind of in the positive range. So not too bad. Even if this, we're sort of, who was it who just mentioned this? Jenna, right? Even if you saw things kind of like more of a spread, right? It's really important not just to consider this quantitative data, but then to also look at the qualitative data. Yes, Andrew, thank you. Why did I get it too? Yeah, I would also worry about the same thing. But in any case, it's important to remember that this is just the quantitative data. There's going to be more information coming. So even if it were a kind of like, again, spread out, it's really important just to fixate on that. Because in the end, you want to be able to contextualize that quantitative data with the qualitative data. So remember that the numbers only tell a part of the story. Those qualitative responses can help, again, contextualize and flesh out the quantitative data, which helps us figure out what sort of actionable changes we should make. And that should really be the goal. What are some actionable changes we can make? And so we'll talk about how to do that specifically, or how to arrange and sort the qualitative data specifically to lead to those actionable changes, or the reflection and then the actionable changes. So before we go any farther, I do want to share that these sort of strategies for organizing that qualitative data that you get. So instead of just reading through the comments and kind of coming up with informal patterns in your head, it can sometimes be very helpful to organize the comments using either, on paper, or you can use a PDF. You can also just do sort of a copy and paste into a Word document. But I think that the digital tools, Miro and Padlet, are actually going to be far more useful in terms of organizing, especially if you have a brain that works that way. And I'm just going to switch really quickly over here to Miro. You can see kind of how it works. Can everybody see the Miro example? Yes, good. You can see how it works. They kind of look like Post-it notes. Padlet functions in the same way. And you can get free accounts for both of these, by the way. And you can organize and color code and move things around. So you can see here, these are just the comments organized. These are the unsorted per question. And then these are the ones that you sort of organize by theme. And then you might start organizing them by pattern and moving them around. And zoom in just a little bit so you can see that you've got sort of these, you've got the full comments there. So I think this is a really good tool for, again, sorting those comments in a way that's going to be most helpful to you. And again, you can get those as free accounts. So once you do that, you want to start, and somebody's already pointed this out, that they look for themes or patterns. And so you'll want to start identifying those trends and those outliers. And there's lots of different themes that you can organize by. You can look at organization, return time of work or feedback, instructor availability, difficulty level of the course, engagement, etc. You can also sort of sort them from high to low, high being sort of the most positive and specific, to low being more negative and maybe less specific. And then you'll want to sort of look at them in terms of like how many comments are in each theme. I think that's a really important thing, because again, that can help you focus on the positive as well as maybe some of the negative. You'll also want to look for those outliers. What are some things that are maybe, just completely no one else has mentioned, or that seem out of the blue? Where might there be contradictions? And then look for some consistency within the comments. So our students sort of talking about the same things, but maybe in a slightly different way. What's going on there? So again, that's going to help you get a little closer to identifying some actionable changes. So we have here a set of unsorted qualitative comments that I'm going to give you just a couple minutes to look through and read, so that I don't have to necessarily read them out to you. We are going to see a couple of slides coming next that have these organized into themes. So I'll just give you a couple minutes to read these.
These are all comments from the same course.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
So I'm gonna give you about 1 more minute. Okay. Wait, everybody's had time to look through most of them. While everyone was reading, Jenna asked a really good question about whether or not folks, if we'd heard anecdotally about anyone using AI to um, streamline the process of sorting and theme identification. I have not personally heard of anyone doing that, but I'm pretty sure someone or many people are just to make the process easier. And I've recommended sort of similar uses of AI for faculty, especially around giving students feedback. So, I recommended, for example, that someone put all of the feedback that she had given students into AI to generate a new set of guidelines for an assignment that would maybe help avoid some of the common issues. The only thing I would say about AI is that you want to be careful because it can be very flattering and tell you really nice things about yourself. And make things seem a little rosier than they are. So you have to be very careful about the kinds of questions you're asking it. And I speak from experience. I was trying to actually get it to be mean to me and it wouldn't do it. I had to be very specific about how mean I wanted it to be. So just be aware of that when you're putting the comments in there. Okay, so one of the themes that we can identify here in terms of the comments are themes on course structure. So Dr. X was always prepared and organized, easy to follow her lectures, great course structure with writing assignments building up to final proposal, broke things down nicely. The assignments were clearly outlined and rubrics were helpful for knowing expectations, liked the course content, but felt disorganized delivery-wise at times, needed more structure, felt a bit disjointed, jumping between different areas of psych, more transition. Is there anything that jumps out at you here that you'd like to comment on?
I mean, overall, I think the structure was pretty good and pretty positively commented on, although you can't please everybody. I mean, you know, there was at least one comment, and everything was very well organized. And then the last comment was maybe it wasn't, or the second to last comment, disorganized delivery wise. So, you know,
Yeah, yeah, but there may also be some opportunity to reflect there. They've got a couple of comments where students, feel maybe things are a little bit disorganized or disjointed. So it might be worth kind of going back and looking through, sort of the lecture materials and the sort of Blackboard site and other things where there might be some disorganization there. Because remember, students perceive things differently than we perceive them. What looks good to us may not always look good to them. So I think, again, it's worth kind of going through and reflecting. But overall, yeah, pretty positive. So some people really like it and some people don't. And in the end, as you pointed out, I'm sorry, I don't know who said that because you have the Zoom name that was assigned to you. But as you point out, it may also be possible that there's nothing much that can be changed. But I think the important thing is to just kind of think about, okay, is there something that I can do? If so, what is it? And let me do it. Discussion boards. So here's another theme that students commented on this class. So just wanted to reiterate that the discussion board posts were my favorite part, learned a ton. Discussion boards were awesome for prepping for class and hearing different views, really made me think. Online discussions could get redundant week to week, need to mix up formats. Of course, Blackboard site was not super user-friendly, better formatting needed. Any thoughts on this one, these set of comments? What you might do with them? Feel free to raise your Zoom hand or post in chat if you'd rather not talk.
Oh, sorry, I was just gonna jump in,
Go
but
ahead.
some of these seem to represent something that I think I struggle with evaluations is when you have directly contradictory comments and what do you do with
Yeah.
like somebody said it was their favorite part and somebody said it got redundant, the formatting wasn't great. And so like it's hard to decide on actions then, I think.
Yeah. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? I think that's a really good point. The contradictions are, yeah, sometimes you're like, okay, what do I do? What do I do about that? What do I do with that?
I usually just go with which one's the majority and which one's the minority and focus on that. If most people are saying good things, then it's probably most people are enjoying it and think it's beneficial. Other way
Yeah.
around, it's probably the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Carmen says, I usually ignore these when I get both positive and negative about an activity format. People like different things, and I try to have lots of different activity types. So I would, yeah, I mean, I think those are all really good responses. I think there's also, some opportunity here to think about, okay, am I just doing discussion boards? So we don't have the context for this class, right? It's like, are discussion boards the only activity that's happening week after week? In which case, might be good to mix things up. Other students might like it as well. You might like it so that you're not having to look at discussion boards every week. But again, this is one of those things that you reflect, you think, okay, are there any changes that I could make to try to address these other comments? If appropriate, and if not, that's okay too. There are other things that you can do to talk to students about, for example, why you have the discussion boards, why they're important, and other ways of addressing this kind of feedback that doesn't necessarily require major changes. Thank you, Rachel. So you say, I think that oftentimes when there's conflicting feedback, there might be system limitations present as well. Perhaps utilizing a particular format, content, et cetera, is of course required. You're right. And we will actually get to that because we're going to go to focus on these unhelpful, off-topic, or beyond instructors' control comments. And that's sort of what you're referencing there, Rachel, definitely. So wishing I could take this as a sophomore instead of my first semester, definitely appreciated it more later. That has nothing to do with you or the course. Having class over the lunch hour was tough when running between other classes. Different time would be better. Okay? Yes, great. Point taken. Class was pretty big, which made it hard to discuss sometimes. Prefer smaller seminar feel. Again, not within the professor's control. It's just not. My only other note is the room was pretty cramped for a bigger class size. Instructors don't determine classroom spaces. 12 p.m. class, again, this sort of comes up. Who thought that was a good idea? Not a fan of Dr. X's outfits, kind of unprofessional for a professor, just being honest. This is a really rough comment because it's just really unprofessional and not appropriate for people to be commenting on someone else's appearance. And then didn't mesh with the professor's teaching style, even though she was definitely knowledgeable. This is one of those comments where it's like, you don't get any specific feedback. So what are you supposed to do with it? What about your teaching style was the problem for this student? Without any sort of specifics, you can't possibly address it. And in fact, you may take it personally, which I don't recommend that you do, because again, this is one of those things where it's like, what exactly is the complaint here? It could be that you have a particular tone of voice that they don't like, which again is not something within your control.
Yeah. Well, students at this, I don't know what, this is a sophomore class, I guess. I mean, students at this stage probably have not been given much of any instruction or education on how to give feedback about a class.
Yes.
So they're probably just,
sure.
mostly shooting from the hip and, which is okay.
Yes.
I mean, you're going to get what you're going to get.
Yes, or they're writing these kinds of comments when they're tired or hungry or stressed out. You don't know what the conditions are, right? And what they know or don't know about giving feedback. So a lot of these you really are things to pay too much attention to. With that said, sometimes it can be helpful to look deeper at the off-topic comments, especially if they're bugging you. Class was pretty big, which made it hard to discuss sometimes. Prefer smaller seminar feel. Just didn't mesh with the prof's teaching style, even though she was definitely knowledgeable. That second comment could have something to do related to the class size, that the teaching style might need to be adjusted for that. So there may be something there to think about and look at. So if you can reflect again and find anything possibly to think about changing. This class was pretty big, which made it hard to discuss sometimes. As well as the bigger class size. This may be something to go to the department about. Maybe the class size does need to be smaller. Maybe you would like it to be smaller, and there's a good reason to make the change. If it's possible. It's not always possible. We don't really have control over these things. And then, sort of classroom spaces. That's also good to know. You, again, may not be able to do anything about it, but if it's something that you can do something about, if you can mention it to the department or whoever does the scheduling of the spaces, then it's worth sort of doing if it sort of matters enough and you think it's going to be it's going to improve student learning, then I think it's worth maybe taking a little bit further and seeing what you can do about it. But again, really, these things are outside of your control. It depends on other people to want to be able to make those changes. So something to think about, but not necessarily something to worry too much about. And then again, that whole thing about the outfits, that is just an inappropriate comment. And it's one of those things to address when you're giving students a little bit of training in how to produce feedback for these kinds of evaluations, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Other things to do, lean into the negative. She's heartless. She taught the class like it was a graduate course and didn't care about those of us who failed. You know, this is a very harsh comment. I would be sort of devastated if I saw it. But before you dismiss it
Really? I
entirely,
don't know. I'd kind
or
of just
maybe,
blow it off.
yeah. Are there any nuggets of truth found in the comments? So are the students, you know, is there something that's stressing them out? Is there something that maybe you're doing that could be
Yeah.
changed that would help improve the situation so that they didn't necessarily feel like this? Sometimes I think students have expectations, especially of undergraduate courses and the level of difficulty, because they've got such a wide variety of experience that they may have expectations coming into the class about the difficulty. And maybe you can, at the very beginning, explain this class is going to be extremely rigorous, and here's why it needs to be rigorous, and here's how I'm going to support you. So maybe there's a way to kind of prepare them for this sort of thing. And then how do my students' perspectives compare to mine? Again, where is that student coming from? Why might they think this way? Hang on a second, I just lost an earbud. Let me mute my video really quickly. That's never happened before. Had to crawl under the desk to get it, of course. So anyway, how do my students' perspectives compare to mine? Where might they be coming from? Instead of just assuming that they're sort of being mean about it. You know, why do they think this? And again, if there's something that you can do to sort of change it or at least set them up and set their expectations appropriately, then I think it's a good idea to consider it. All right. All right. So the last thing, of course, all the things that we've been talking about, just again, step back and look at the bigger picture. What do you think about your comments? What stood out? What my students have felt or experienced? How do my students' perspectives compare to mine? How might those similarities and differences in our perspectives reflect the similarities and differences in our identities and lived experience? Again, this is, you know, sort of going back to what I said about students' expectations of the course and their sort of understanding of their own learning practices and needs versus your understanding what you think they should be doing and what you think they need, and trying to sort of negotiate that relationship instead of expectations. I think is really important because it's going to increase students' sense of inclusion and belonging in classes, which again is going to contribute to their overall success. And then just in terms of looking forward, if you were to teach this course again, what would you change and why? What might keep you from making those changes? So there's some systematic things that you may have control over. And so how are you going to maybe, instead of you know, try to make those big changes that you can't, you know, again, you don't have any control over making. How are you going to sort of mitigate the situation? And then how is my thinking and teaching changing, or my thinking about teaching changing? So what are some things that are sort of developing? And again, this is about being that growth mindset and seeing this feedback as an opportunity to make improvements and make changes based on the feedback that you've gotten. Sometimes those are small changes, sometimes they're big changes. It just kind of depends on what you're getting. If you are afraid of getting the student evaluations and reading the student evaluations, I didn't see anyone comment in the chat about that. Maybe if we had had the poll, it would have been different. But again, if that's something, if you like dread reading your comments at the end of the semester or at the end of the year, then maybe, you know, instead embrace a growth mindset, set aside a time dedicated to reviewing evaluations. Again, when you're not tired or hungry or stressed. Although stress, I don't know when that's not a thing. Make sure you practice some self-compassion. Everyone gets negative reviews from time to time, if not every semester. And in fact, when I was a faculty member, we were very skeptical of people who only got really positive reviews, because typically those people were also the ones who were known on campus for giving easy A's. So really important to think about the context and the fact that you can't please everybody all the time. And often when you're being rigorous and challenging, and students aren't happy about that, it's reflected in the feedback. Definitely lean on your colleagues. If again, this is something if you're in avoidance mode, try the buddy system, ask someone to screen your evaluations first so you can look at theirs in return, and then just sort of generally give a summary of the feedback. This is where AI might also be helpful, where you can share what the AI's feedback or synthesis of the feedback was with your colleague. And then remember again that these are students' perceptions of teaching, not of learning. Time is needed for students to reflect on their learning. So they may be unhappy with what happened in the class, or they may not say much about it at all, but it doesn't mean that they didn't learn anything. And there's other evidence that you probably have at your disposal to suggest that they have. Especially, again, any assessments that you've done, any assignments that you've received, you can sort of look back and reflect on those. The other thing you can do is in preparation for those end of semester evaluations is seek feedback before then. So for example, Kate does something called the mid-semester student feedback survey, where we go into classes and we actually ask students to complete an anonymous survey for us, and we share those results with the faculty member mid-semester. That's really helpful for identifying any potential issues and actionable changes that could be made either then or in the future. So if that's something you'd like to do, we can talk about it. Just really quickly, some of the bias and limitations of student evaluations of teaching. There's so much research on this to show that there is a great deal of bias in evaluations. Student evaluations are complex. Again, bias, these are their perceptions, not necessarily the reality. And giving feedback as a skill, as we've already talked about. There's also a lot of value here. It's a good source of data. It has its limitations, but it's still useful. And it provides us an opportunity for reflection to really think, okay, did the student have a legitimate reason to make these kinds of comments? And if so, is there something I can do about it? And if not, that's okay as well. In terms of bias, sources of bias, when they're instructor-based, these are often, again, tons of good research about this. There's a lot of bias in terms of gender, race and ethnicity, additional historically marginalized identities. There's also course-based bias, so the modality, whether it's in person, online, or hybrid, the size of the class. Larger classes are going to get different kinds of evaluations versus smaller. And the format of the class, is it sort of lecture-based? Is there lots of discussion? Is it a flipped classroom? It all really kind of depends on the nature of the course, and these things should be considered whenever you're looking at your course evaluations, and anyone else is looking at your course evaluations for that matter. So again, student responses are shaped by course and individual characteristics unrelated to actual instructor quality. It's very important to remember that when we're looking at student evaluations. So we're coming to the part where we're going to talk about preparing your students. This is a really important piece because, again, many students don't know the purpose that evaluations serve. They just think, oh, it's this thing I have to do at the end of the semester. And since we've shifted, it's been a long time, but since we've shifted to electronic evaluations where students are no longer completing them in class, unless you give them the opportunity to do so or you offer them extra credit for completing them, we tend to get lower response rates. And so, and again, that's because, it's a very busy time of the semester. They don't necessarily think about what is important here. But Iowa State University gives us an example of things that you can say to your students as you're preparing them to do those evaluations. I also recommend, again, if you have time to do them in class or give students time to do them in class, that's a really good way to get a larger response rate or to do any kind of extra credit. So student evaluations of teaching play an important role in the review of faculty. Your opinions influence the review of instructors that take place every year. Iowa State University recognizes that student evaluations of teaching are often influenced by students' unconscious biases about the race and gender of the instructor. Women and instructors of color are systematically rated lower in their teaching evaluations than white men, even when there are no actual differences in the instruction or in what students have learned. As you fill out the course evaluation, please keep this in mind and make an effort to resist stereotypes about professors. Focus on your opinions about the content of the course, the assignments, the textbooks, the in-class material, and not unrelated matters such as the instructor's appearance. This can be a tricky statement to read depending on who is delivering it. So I have given, sort of late in my career, given students the kind of advice about student evaluations and also mentioned what they were used for in terms of promotion and tenure. And I've explained to students what the tenure process was. And I actually did have a student in the feedback say that I was deliberately trying to manipulate their feedback. So, yep, think about how you want to phrase this, depending again on who you are, what your context is, what your students are like. I think it is again really important to point out the places in which the evaluations can be biased, or what kind of bias impacts them. But again, really kind of depends on your sort of positionality and how comfortable you feel talking about that. You may instead just focus on what the evaluations are used for by the institution and what you plan to use them for. And I think that can be just a really, that alone can be often enough to get some better evaluations, along with giving them the time in class to actually complete them. So you get a much broader range of responses as opposed to those who just remember to kind of do it at the very end quickly and without much thought. I have also asked, as I mentioned earlier, specific questions or some specific questions, things that I wanted them to maybe think about and give me some anonymous feedback on, because they were things that I felt were not going as well, or I felt needed to be tweaked a little bit. And so it would be helpful for them to let me know what their ideas were. And so kind of giving them a little bit of extra prompting, I think can also be helpful in terms of getting useful responses as opposed to comments about your outfits. So again, giving feedback is a skill. You can also build in opportunities for practice, giving feedback throughout the course. You can do that in the mid-semester student feedback. You can also do polls, anonymous polls, and your own surveys throughout the semester. This is a really good opportunity to just do temperature checks, get a feel for how the students are handling things. Are they stressed? Are they worried? When you do that, of course, you want to provide those clear instructions and expectations for the feedback, including the purpose of the feedback and how you plan to use it, especially if you're giving them opportunities to give you feedback in the middle of the semester. So it's really important that if they're doing that, you don't just take the feedback and do nothing with it. You actually maybe debrief a little bit and say, thank you so much for completing the surveys. Here's what you told me, and here's how I'm going to use it either immediately or in the future. Or you provide explanations for why you can't change certain things. So if all your students complain about the timing of the midterm or any other exam, you might want to explain why you couldn't have it at another point in the semester. Because often they see our schedule and our materials and our assignments and our exams, but they don't necessarily understand the method behind the madness. They're not participating in our thinking about how and why things are structured and what you have control over and what your department has control over. They don't know, they don't see the operations, right? They only see the curtain. They don't see that man behind the curtain. And so it's really important to give them a little bit more information about how things work, especially if they're being generous and giving you the feedback that you need. You can also give them examples of constructive feedback. So what that actually looks like, because again, if they've never really seen it before, where would they have seen it unless they were the recipient themselves? It can be really, really useful to them to see what it might actually look like instead of just, kind of winging it when they're going to do those student evaluations of that particularly stressful part of the semester. So we're almost, to spring break. It's time to think about how you're going to prepare your students for their spring evaluations. So definitely set aside some time in class, maybe 5 to 10 minutes, either at the beginning or at the end, and then talk with students about the evaluation process, explain the purpose and how you'll use the information, even though obviously it's at the very end and, they're not going to be in that class with you again. They may have you another time. Talk about how you plan to use that information, whether it's for, changes that you're going to make to the course or the sort of evaluation process that you go through, whatever it is. I think it's important to let them know and be transparent about what you're going to do with that info. Communicate that you value their feedback. This is also really important. I don't think they always realize that we use it, we value it, and it's really important for us to get it, even though we may dread it. and that it's better if they can be more specific so that you can actually do some actionable things with it. Along those same lines, describe this type of feedback that is useful, and then share examples of how you have used feedback. So if your students, for example, if you had a majority of them complain about the length of your lectures, and you decided, yeah, you know what, these are maybe a little bit too long and I need to build in some more active learning activities, absolutely talk about that experience, because that's going to set them up again for writing the kinds of evaluations that are going to be most helpful for you. And you're not going to hopefully get any or as many comments about things that are outside of your control. Priming them, the more you can do that, the better, so that, again, you get really useful evaluations. So I'd like to open it up for discussion. Any questions, any things that you'd like to share about evaluations or about the workshop? We have quite a bit of time here for discussion before you have to run off to your 12 o'clock, or sorry, your 1 o'clock meeting, class, or activity.
Yeah, I think yeah, I'm Mark Scalante. I'm from emergency medicine. I am not Lydia, obviously. Um, but for a lot of us, we teach in the classroom, but we also teach at the bedside. And sometimes those, they're different skills. And often, and some people are great at both, and some people are better at one than the other. And so, the evaluations we get from, residents primarily, are sometimes a little different between those two types of teaching.
Yeah. Can you say a little bit more about the evaluations that you get from residents? What are the kinds of things? Are they formal, informal? What are the processes for those evaluations?
So our residents, some of them are coordinated by our chief residents. I'm not, and it probably varies a little bit from year to year how they do that, depending on the chiefs. They have regular meetings with the residents as a group. And so they'll get feedback on our teaching faculty during those times. We do have a formal evaluation they can fill out, particularly during our weekly conferences. There's an online evaluation where, that we encourage people to fill out, and so we can get feedback. Not just from it's not broken down by, okay, here's feedback from residents and here's feedback from your fellow core faculty that are also there. I don't know that we have the bandwidth to break it up. It would be probably a little kind of interesting to get to do that, but we just, from our office staff, we just wouldn't be able to do it probably.
Right. So,
and then at the end of the year, the chief residents coordinated like a big evaluation meeting, and where they go through basically the list of attendings. And it's primarily evaluating our core faculty, which is a group of 14 of us. And then there's a group, the docs that work here, I don't know, it's about 30 or 35 total. So, about a third of us are on the core faculty. And so the evaluations, or teaching evaluations at the bedside are probably a little different for the core faculty who, have a lot of time and effort invested in the education, as opposed to somebody who just teaches while they're, working and seeing patients.
Yeah. So are you generally is the purpose of those evaluations, they are intended to be formative or summative or both?
Probably a little bit of both.
Okay.
Yeah.
So kind of the same principles apply in terms of thinking about what is the feedback, what are some patterns, right? What changes can you make based on what the feedback you got? So very similar kind of actions steps that you can take in terms of reflecting on the feedback and doing something actionable with it, with the context in mind, right? And the situation. Like, again, it's going to be different, the bedside teaching, because you've got other people in the room with you. It's not just you and the students as in a classroom environment. There's obviously a patient there when you're teaching and also treating someone. So that has to be taken into consideration when you're looking at all of that and thinking about the context.
Yeah. And we have techs, we have nurses, we have all, radiology. So we have all kinds of other people working and are involved in the environment that, we may get feedback from them. And just one of the things in our department, and that takes a lot of time, is that when patients come in and say they have chest pain or something, they'll get an EKG out at triage. And so one of the metrics for the hospital is, this thing has to be read like within a few minutes. And
Mm,
so they'll bring it to one of the attendings working to try to read it, and then you sign off on it.
yeah.
And so there's a lot, they do a lot of EKGs. And so the
Mhm.
workflow interruptions are pretty numerous
Yeah.
just with EKGs. And so this is a few years ago, but it seemed like they were bringing me every single one of them. And I finally like sort of snapped a little bit and kind of barked at one of the techs and got back. They gave some feedback to our nursing care manager, who I've known for a long time and get along with very well. And she pulled me aside like the next day and said, "Hey, I don't know what was going on, but you were kind of an a-hole to the techs." And I mean, she was right. And so, I mean,
Yeah.
since then, I've made a very concerted effort to just, give me the EKG, I'll read it, I'll take care of it. And, I mean, they're just doing their job, you know,
Yeah.
and I got to do mine.
Yeah, I think it's really important to, this is sort of an example of like, you know, um, feedback that we get about some behavior that was clearly not good behavior.
Right.
Everybody makes mistakes.
Oh, right.
Even in the, best of situations, it's easy to lose your temper,
Yeah.
make a decision that isn't the right decision. And I think the most important part is not necessarily trying to avoid the mistake, but trying to understand why it happened,
Yeah.
and just to continue to do better and apologize when it's appropriate.
Yeah.
I do sessions on like feedback, and one of the things that I have talked about with people is like, yes, every now and then you're going to give some bad feedback, and it's not going to be particularly helpful, and it might actually,
Yeah.
be harmful. And it's important, instead of like, feeling bad about it, to actually, apologize, change, do the things that you can do to ameliorate the situation.
Yeah.
And certainly we've all had moments, if you teach in the classroom space as well, there's probably been moments when you've done things that you wish you hadn't done it that way.
Yeah.
And you would like it to be better. Lori, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, so one of the things with the health science education department, at least for like my teaching, is we don't have a full semester of teaching. We have certain
Oh, yeah.
blocks, and we may not teach every block. So how do you get constructive feedback in situations like that, where it's meaningful for this year versus next year? Because it sounds like, I mean, this is my first year, but like talking with all of my other colleagues, each class has their own kind of personality. So what may work this year may not work next year. So what are your recommendations? Like, I know we get evaluations on our courses, but do you have any recommendations for that, as far as feedback goes for like this year, even if you're not teaching like a full semester course?
Yeah. So tell me how long the blocks are. So if you're teaching a block,
Um,
how long might that be?
well, it depends on the block, but Dr. Regan, correct me if I'm wrong. I would say 6 to 8 weeks, but like
Okay.
even within that time frame, I may only teach 3 weeks, or I may
Gotcha.
teach 2 courses or like 2 lectures or something within.
So the
Yeah.
end of course evaluation might be about all the teachers or all the instructors, right,
Yes,
in
there's
that
that
block.
too with some of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Before I say anything, does anybody have, there's this entire group here. Does anybody have any thoughts on Lori's question? So how do you get some actionable feedback when you may only be teaching, 3 weeks of a much longer semester,
Hmm.
instead of, again, waiting for the end of semester student evaluations? Any thoughts? Yeah, I usually get minimal from random lectures. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, like, if there's any general, like, I usually kind of look for generalities, like things that would apply no matter what topic I'm teaching, or, because, yeah, like really specific things about a particular session aren't going to be applicable for another full year. And so,
Right.
but
Right.
if there's things like, wish that we would have gone through all the incorrect answers as well as correct. Like I can take that and apply that to other sessions too. So I don't know if
Yeah.
that helps, Lori, but it's one thing that I thought of.
Yeah. So there's sort of generalizing from that, again, the end of semester kind of evaluations. Personally, what I would do is if I wanted feedback that was going to be beneficial to me, I would create my own survey and ask students in the class to complete it when I was done with my block, as long as that was sort of permissible within the department. That's what I would do because I would want to know beforehand, and I would make it very easy and very quick to complete. Just use a Google form. And you can have, this is another place where AI might be useful because you can have the AI then just analyze the results for you instead of having to read through the whole thing. But if that's an option, that's certainly something I would do. And you can ask very specific because it's your own survey that you're creating, or that maybe you're creating and all of the instructors who teach blocks within that course can use. And that you can sort of work with each other to create something that's usable. Then and again, explaining the purpose of those surveys to the students, then that's maybe something that you can try, and you can get some really specific questions there, like do they like the the assignments, or do they like the lectures? What about the lectures do they like? That kind of thing. And you can try to get more specific and detailed information. But again, that just really depends on all of the people teaching the course director, and making sure that it's okay to give those kinds of surveys in the class. What do you think of that, Lori? Is that something, and Jenna, that is possible?
Or is that possible, Jenna?
Well, so with our setup, like med students complete evaluations at the end of each week, and that's where they evaluate ask specifically about the teaching and the content for every individual session that week. So that's where we kind of get like individual feedback, and then they complete an overall course evaluation at the end of the course, and that's more about the course as a whole and the assessments and things like that. So my inkling would be that it should be, if you're going to add anything more on top of that, it would be very sparingly, because they're already like getting a lot of survey fatigue. And so if you want to know about one specific thing, pop it up as like a thing at the end of the class or something. But I'd be hesitant. I don't think you'll get great response rates if you try to add too much in addition to that. That's just my thought. I don't know what others would contribute.
Well, and I think so, and it looks like Dr. Fisher says we're not allowed to send individual surveys to students. And I think like one of the things that was helpful, like we talked this year, and like this class doesn't like small groups, but some of that, like I don't know. I feel like what's real time. And I think maybe I need to look at those weekly things, because I was just getting it like 8 weeks after the block for all the evaluations. And at that point I was like, okay, and partly because I'm new too, I think it was like more concerning, like, okay, what do I need to change? Not that I don't need to worry about that always, but like especially more anxious about it this year. But so maybe looking at those weekly reports would
if
help.
you already have a report that exists, there's no reason to give them an additional survey, because again, survey fatigue is real. So I would say look at the weekly reports, and then as you're getting that information, like you said, they were complaining about small groups. It's one of the things that students always complain about, and it's not necessarily something that you want to change, but it might be one of those things that you can then, the next time you go to do it, you explain the importance of small groups again. Sometimes they just need to hear why it's important to learn to work together in these small groups and these activities, because they're going to be working in teams, right? And for the rest of their lives, presumably. And so it's really important for them to learn to do this in the classroom space as well. And you can also talk about why it's good for their learning. So you won't necessarily make a change, but you'll just kind of reinforce the purpose of the practice. And you can do that, right? If you have that feedback for that week, you can do it in the, you can sort of make that explanation or give that explanation in the following week. Or you can ask them for additional feedback, verbal feedback in class about what it is about small groups they don't like. That's another option, certainly.
Thank you.
Yeah. So yes, thank you to everybody who put things in chat. So definitely not allowed to send individual surveys to students, which makes sense given that you're doing the weekly surveys. And then if you can do that, Rachel says I use program called Typeform that it's very easy to create and distribute your own survey and simply use a QR code. The program puts together all the data in a nice clean format. if I find Google Forms to be more work and difficult to get the user settings friendly and accessible, that is definitely true. So thank you for sharing that with us, Rachel. If anybody is able to use that, that'd be great. It is 1 o'clock, by the way, or just after 1 o'clock. So I just want to say thank you to all of you for coming and for participating in this session. And again, if you need any support, you can reach out to Lydia or you can reach out to me. Happy to do one-on-one consultations and talk to you more about any of the sort of things that you have, any concerns you have about teaching. Yeah, thanks again for coming.